the things that were discussed in this session, the smart growth planning principles and some grants that came out of those plans. So these are principles that are not being mandated, but it's being asked of municipalities to try to apply these principles to their planning.
Yeah, the smart growth is one of those topics that actually started in January, and we didn't finalize it till March. So there was much discussion. Part of it was, do we mandate local entities to use smart growth? What we ended up doing through compromise is saying it's optional for cities and counties to use smart growth, but we prefer you to use smart growth if you're going to tie into the $30 million from the iJobs reconstruction. So we did tie those reconstruction dollars to smart growth. And smart growth doesn't necessarily mean that you're moving a building 2 miles from the river. It can mean something as simple as we don't put critical utility in the basement, we put the HVAC and other utilities on the roof. Or you make the buildings more accessible to, if water is going to come in, there's a chance, then it's easier to clean up. Use concrete instead of drywall. Something that says we know there's a chance of flooding, and so we're going to make it easier to clean up and get back to business.
Well, and flooding in some cases can't be avoided. So we have to have these plans in place. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of floodplain management and working to educate Iowans about the floodplains. Right in the floodplain of the Iowa River in Iowa City, 150 years of buildings being built in that area, and you can see the natural walls of the original riverbed, and there's all these beautiful buildings, Hancher Auditorium and the new art building that are in there, and that's the sort of thing that this would address, this floodplain management. Let's look at the natural floodplain and apply some of these principles.
Well, the floodplain management was probably 80% of our discussion in the Rebuild Iowa Committee. When you look at a map, a topographical map of Iowa, it's hard to build away from creeks and streams in the Iowa River. There's many tributaries in the state. I think what we have to look at is smart management. One of the things we're going to have to look at too is the fact that rivers change. Rivers change by the hour and by the decade. It's where their water flowed 10 years ago is not where they flow today. So we have to look at that. We have a great entity right here in Johnson County with the Flood Center at the University of Iowa. We funded them with $1.3 million. They're coming out with new ideas on how to study flooding in Iowa. A little sensor that goes underneath the bridges in Iowa gives real-time information on the waters rising all across Iowa, so we don't have to make predictions from the Army Corps of Engineers how much water is coming towards you. We know right now in a certain creek in Iowa County or Poweshiek County that's going to affect Johnson County, this is the amount of water coming your way. It also tells us immediate changes in those rivers. So with the Flood Center, and I have to mention his name, Larry Weber just runs a great shop over there. He came and talked to our group a number of times. I think we're just going to have to get better on where we build and where we continue to rebuild in the state of Iowa.
And you just mentioned this, a county north of us affecting our flooding here. Watershed management was another topic that the legislature tackled. So let's talk a bit about that.
Well, watershed management is indeed the key to floodplain management. The problem or some of the barriers that we ran into is it became an urban versus rural discussion, because a lot of urban legislators were saying, well, how does tiled land in agricultural communities affect the runoff what comes to our area? But rightfully so, ag areas were saying, well, what about the floodwater or the stormwater retention methods some cities use? Basically, it's a combination of the two. Everyone's going to have to come to the table and look at what we do when it rains here. As in 1993, the flood was water that came from the rains right here on top of us. In 2008, it was rains that occurred north and west of us. So watershed management also has to include Minnesota and Wisconsin, because a lot of the watershed from those two states affects us right here in Johnson County.
So across these political divisions, there needs to be cooperation and communication.
And that is the key, is the cooperation, communication between states, between counties, between city entities. And that's easier said than done sometimes when people get to their home turf and issues that they feel are near and dear to them.
Now, flooding being inevitable, people are going to be trying to negotiate grants and assistance and all sorts of things. So there was a discussion about case management, how to help individuals who are seeking help recovery.
Yeah, one of the things that we learned from the flood of 2008 and somewhat from the 2003 flood also is that we need a single point of contact, and that single point of contact should have the information that they need to rebuild, whether it's residential, commercial, or a combination of the two. What we found is too many entities would come up and say, well, like for instance, a person in Coralville actually had to go to Cedar Rapids to file for aid. And then right next door to them, they would come to the city of Iowa City. So right where that line is drawn, that made a decision where people went to apply for some of the aid that they might be eligible for. So in the future, I think we need to consolidate that and make that one point of contact. And also the second thing we need to learn is how to get that aid quicker. But what we're doing with Smart Growth is also saying we can't use taxpayers' dollar every time if we continue to rebuild in the same places without smart buildings.
Right, so these are all really interconnected
Correct.
Issues. It looks like it was a very good comprehensive discussion that happened on the floor.
It was a very good discussion on the floor. And I will say this, the corridor legislators, Democrat, Republicans, basically came together on this issue because they're working for their district. So it was one of those moments in politics you say, this is why I'm here. People are working together.